Hey, if you're here, don't forget to subscribe to the Curiosity Wiki YouTube channel. Activate the bell to be the first to see the new videos. Emergency alert. Missile threat near Hawaii. Seek shelter immediately. This is not a drill. This message from the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency flooded the cell phones of Hawaii residents on January 13, 2018. Those listening to the radio or watching TV were notified. If you are indoors, stay indoors. If you are outside, seek shelter in buildings immediately. Stay indoors well away from windows. If you are driving, pull safely to the side of the road and seek shelter in a building or lie down on the ground. It was to be expected that chaos would ensue. There were reports of hotels evacuating customers and staff, people stuck in traffic abandoning their cars, and others simply ignoring advice to stay indoors. However, seconds passed and there was no missile, no explosion, no nuclear annihilation. 38 minutes after the initial transmission of the emergency, the following message was transmitted. Emergency alert. There is no threat or danger to the state of Hawaii. Repeat. False alarm. It had all been a mistake. Someone had selected the wrong option during a routine check, turning a test scenario into a real one. But what if the alert had been real? The situation has been portrayed on TV and in movies for years, but what will it be like in reality, and what should you really do? Will a nuclear bomb automatically destroy your entire city? What is the safest place to take shelter? Fortunately for most of humanity, nuclear weapons have only been used in war twice. In 1945, when the US dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan at the end of World War II. The first bomb, which fell on Hiroshima, codenamed Little Boy, exploded with a force of between 12,000 and 15,000 tons of TNT and immediately destroyed an area of 13 square kilometers. The fireball it produced was 370 meters in diameter, with a surface temperature of 6,000 degrees Celsius, roughly the same as the surface of the sun. The results of both bombings were catastrophic, with an estimated 185,000 people killed in the attacks. Perhaps the most miraculous story to emerge from the atomic bombings is that of Tsutomu Yamaguchi, who was on a business trip to Hiroshima on August 6, 1945 when he suddenly, I thought the sun fell from the sky. He had just enough time to throw himself into a ditch and, even though he was only 2 miles from the center of the blast, he survived. He suffered severe burns, temporary blindness, and broken eardrums. He returned home to Nagasaki just in time to go through the second atomic bomb 3 days later. This time he was in an office and again somehow managed to survive, thanks to a ladder that reduced the ferocity of the explosion in the building. We leave it to you to decide whether he is the luckiest or unluckiest man in history. However, while Mr. Yamaguchi is the only recognized survivor of both nuclear attacks, a 2006 documentary found 165 other fellow citizens who survived both attacks. Despite the huge death toll and devastation, the vast majority of residents in both cities survived, with around 71% of the population in Hiroshima and 76% in Nagasaki managing to survive the attack. This should give us all hope that, should the unthinkable happen, we might escape with our lives. Now, some of you are probably thinking that nuclear weapons have come a long way since World War II. And you won't be wrong. The most powerful nuclear weapon ever created, the Tsar Bomb, was detonated by the USSR in 1961. The blast it produced was 50 megatons, 3,000 more than Hiroshima, or 10 times the total munitions used in World War II. Even if you were 100 kilometers away, you'd still get third-degree burns. Now, we have some very bad news and some not so bad. The very bad news is that Russia is currently developing a 100 megaton nuclear bomb. That's double the Tsar Bomb. If one of these nuclear bombs were to hit New York City, then 8 million people would be killed. However, the less bad news is that in 2011 the US government produced a report on how the authorities should respond to a nuclear attack. Instead, they focused on improvised nuclear devices, or INDs, which are smaller devices. The type of device that could be used by a terrorist organization and therefore that people are more likely to encounter. As the report noted, a low-yield explosion from an IND is very different from the Cold War strategic thermonuclear detonation scenarios on which much of our current understanding and civil defense planning is based. Ultimately, however, your chances of survival come down to two factors: the yield of the detonated bomb and your immediate response to the attack. Let's examine each of these factors in turn. The yield of a nuclear weapon is a reference to the energy it releases. The higher the yield, the more powerful the bomb, usually expressed in kilotons or megatons of TNT. It is the yield of the bomb that will decide how likely it is that people will die instantly. While we're here, let's pause for a moment to dispel a common misconception about the damage caused by a powerful nuclear bomb. It's logical to assume that a bomb 1,000 times more powerful than any other would cause 1,000 times more damage, but it doesn't. A bomb 1,000 times more powerful than the one that hit Hiroshima would cause damage just as severe when exploded over an area 130 times larger, not 1,000 times larger. Of course, factors such as the design of the weapon, whether it explodes on the surface or in the air, the geography of the site, or even the weather can all have an impact on the final outcome of the blast. If we look again at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even though the second bomb was more powerful, the hills around Nagasaki helped absorb some of the damage, resulting in fewer casualties. So let's look at the scenario considered most likely, the detonation of a 10-kiloton nuclear device. We will say that ground zero is in London and the bomb is detonated at surface level. The yellow circle represents the fireball, which has a radius of about 200 meters for our relatively modest bomb. Remember that the temperature at the surface of the fireball is similar to that of the sun, and inside the fireball, at the point of detonation, the temperature is actually millions of degrees Celsius. Needless to say, being caught in this area means extremely rapid death. The red circle represents the super shock wave. Here, the blast pressure is so great that most buildings are destroyed, and although people can physically withstand the pressure, hurricane-force winds combined with flying debris mean that almost all the people in this area are killed. In the case of an IND, this is 470 meters from the center of the blast. If we move further away, we see the blue circle expanding, illustrating the medium-intensity shock wave. Most of the buildings have collapsed, with many casualties and serious injuries among those who somehow managed to survive. We are now approaching almost 1 kilometer from ground zero. At 1.25 kilometers, we are reaching the limit of extreme radiation. Within this green circle, people are absorbing doses of radiation 800 times higher than the average American is exposed to in a whole year. That means, in practice, death rates of between 50% and 90% from radiation poisoning, leading to a painful death that lasts from just hours to weeks. People will suffer nausea and headaches to start with, followed by hair loss, hemorrhaging and increased chances of infection. Of course, that is if they make it through the first few days. Then, finally, the orange circle, which extends to just over 1.4 kilometers from ground zero, shows the thermal radiation produced by the explosion. The heat is so intense that third-degree burns are almost inevitable. They can be fatal. Even beyond this zone, first and second-degree burns are likely because of the immense heat. In total, an area of 6.2 square kilometers would have been decimated by the hypothetical IND. Some 30,000 people would have died and another 75,000 would have been injured. Some estimates of the death toll in such densely populated areas are much more worrying, as high as 100,000. According to Director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University, even at 13 kilometers there is a 10 to 20% chance of being killed instantly by a 10-kiloton device. Let's now look at scenario 2. What would happen if the biggest bomb was detonated in the same place in London? Not surprisingly, a bomb 5,000 times more powerful produces annihilation, with over 4.5 million dead and an estimated 3 million injured. The thermal radiation from the fireball even reaches near Oxford and Cambridge. It's probably best not to think about what those apocalyptic bombs the Russians are currently working on might do. Regardless of how powerful the bomb is, if you're caught in this area, your chances of survival will take a significant hit, and they'll hit rock bottom if you happen to have the misfortune of being near the ground zero fireball. knowing what to do in the first hour of a nuclear attack could mean the difference between life and death. So now it's time to look at the second factor that will determine your chances of survival: how you respond to the attack. According to the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University, if you see a nuclear flare, the first thing you need to do is take cover behind a barrier in case the shockwave comes. Bear in mind that the shockwave travels at hundreds of kilometers per hour, so you won't have much time to find shelter. However, when Yamaguchi took cover in a nearby ditch, the shockwave lifted him off the ground, spun him around like a tornado, and threw him into a nearby field. A radiation safety specialist recommends taking shelter behind an object that is structurally sound. When I think about where I would go to protect myself from the effects, and especially the blast wave, I think about the same kinds of things we do for tornadoes. Being in an area where, if there's a dramatic shake, things aren't going to fall on you. If you manage to survive the shockwave, things unfortunately don't get too easy. Now it's a real race against time. Essentially, when the bomb explodes, the blast creates a huge amount of dust and debris, which combines with the radioactive products of the nuclear reaction at the heart of the bomb. This radioactive dirt is drawn upwards into the sky by the intense heat, and this is where you usually see that distinctive mushroom cloud. However, as these radioactive particles cool, they return to the ground, and this fallout spells trouble for you. You will have some time to take steps to keep you and your family safe. Most importantly, get inside, and stay informed. You'll have somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes to find shelter. The explosions are overwhelming to your eyesight, as you can lose your vision. Fortunately, according to the Department of Homeland Security website, this loss of vision should only last about a minute. Unfortunately, if the attack occurs at night and you're outside in the dark, the blindness could last up to 35 minutes. For the sake of argument, we'll say that our hypothetical situation takes place during the day, because if you're not blind it's much easier to find shelter. We'll also assume that you haven't prepared for the end of the world and built your own state-of-the-art fallout shelter. Less than 2% of Americans have built a fallout shelter or created a safe space in the basement of their home. This assumption does not apply to Switzerland, which has built about 250,000 shelters, enough to house its entire population. But for the rest of us who don't have a spare bunker around, where should we go? First of all, don't stay in the car. Metal doors and glass windows will be far too thin to protect you from radiation. Mobile homes won't give you adequate shelter either. Instead, try to find a basement or a larger building with several floors, remembering that the key factor is to put as many thick layers as possible between you and the fallout. We're talking concrete or brick here, so glass skyscrapers or houses built of wood and plaster are not the best options. If you want to block 99% of radiation, you need to shelter behind 12.5 centimeters of steel, 40 centimeters of brick or 60 centimeters of compacted earth. If you're in a city with a subway system and a decent level of protection, you'd be better off heading indoors. Assuming you get somewhere above ground, avoid the top floors, as all rainfall will settle on the roof. And the purpose of going indoors is to stay as far away as possible from those pesky dust particles that emit dangerous levels of radiation, which could lead to radiation poisoning. Instead, go to the center of the building. If you have time, try to close off areas where fallout could enter: doors, fireplaces, air conditioners, windows. Okay, let's look at a slightly different scenario, one where things didn't go so well. This time we abandoned the car and ran to the nearest building, but it might be that the precipitation is coming your way. If so, the best thing to do is cover your nose and mouth with a cloth and close your eyes. Well, at this stage you don't know if radiation has been put on you or if you've had any. We don't want to sound too pessimistic, but a bad sign at this stage is if you've already started vomiting. Because your gut is very sensitive to radiation, vomiting is a sign that you've absorbed quite a large dose of radiation. There are plenty of things you can do to get rid of any precipitation that might be on you. Carefully remove the outer layer of your clothes. This can remove 90% of the radioactive material. Put them in a plastic bag and leave it somewhere out of harm's way. Take your time, because if you take your equipment off too quickly you might shake off the radioactive dust, and that won't help anyone. A shower would also be quite useful. By all means treat yourself to soap and shampoo to help wash off, but avoid using conditioner. It will bind radioactive particles to your hair. Even if there is no shower, wash your face, hands and any uncovered body parts using a sink, damp cloth, or wet tissue. Again, the key is to use plenty of water and take your time. The last thing you want to do is scratch and allow radioactive material to soak into your skin. At this point, it's probably been an hour, which means the fallout outside has already decayed by 50%. In the first 24 hours it will have given up 80% of its energy, reaching 99% after 2 weeks. But remember that if the radiation was high enough to begin with, that 1% could still be dangerous, so staying indoors as long as possible significantly reduces the chances of contamination. If you can, wait for government agencies to send help and listen to their instructions before leaving the safe place.